Oladuah Equiano. Equiano, born about 1745 in what is now Nigeria, was a prominent advocate and writer whose life journey epitomizes the resilience of the human spirit. Kidnapped as a child and sold into slavery, Equiano endured the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, surviving the Middle Passage to eventually secure his freedom. Inspired by his experiences, he became a leading figure in the abolitionist movement. The Interesting Narrative of the Life, Abridged. Excerpt 1. The Enslavement. My father, besides many slaves, had a numerous family, of which 7 lived to grow up, including myself and a sister who was the only daughter. As I was the youngest of the sons, I became, of course, the greatest favorite of my mother, and was always with her. And she used to take particular pains to form my mind. I was trained up from the earliest years in the arts of agriculture and war, and my mother adorned me with emblems, after the manner of our greatest warriors. In this way, I grew up till I was turned the age of 11, when an end was put to my happiness in the following manner. Generally, when the grown people in the neighborhood were gone far in the fields to labor, the children assembled together in some of the neighborhood premises to play. And commonly, some of us used to get up a tree to look out for any assailant or kidnapper that might come upon us. For they sometimes took these opportunities of our parents' absence to attack and carry off as many as they could seize. One day, as I was watching at the top of a tree in our yard, I saw one of those people come into the yard of our next neighbor, but one to kidnap. There had been many stout young people in it. Immediately on this, I gave the alarm of the rogue, and he was surrounded by the stoutest of them, who entangled him with cords so that he could not escape till some of the grown people came and secured him. But alas, ere long it was my fate to be thus attacked and to be carried off. When none of the grown people were nigh, one day, when all of our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could till night came on, when we reached a small house, where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep, which allayed our misfortune for a short time. Excerpt 2. The Enslavement Ship. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. When I looked round the ship too, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenance expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate. And, quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I asked them if we were not to be eaten by these white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. They told me I was not. Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off, and left me abandoned to despair. Excerpt 3. The Middle Passage. I now saw myself deprived of all chances of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly. I even wished for my former slavery in preference to my present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind. There I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. With the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wish for the last friend, death, to relieve me. Soon to my grief, two of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across the windlass and tied my feet while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before. If I could have gotten over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. The crew used to watch very closely those of us who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. I have seen some of these poor soul African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. These indeed was often the case with myself. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put under deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. The stench of the hold, while we were on the coast, was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. Some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air, but now that the whole ship's cargo we were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. Sorry about that. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number of the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspiration, so that the air became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims of the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchases. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the change, which now became insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, or toilets, into which the children often fell were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps, for myself, I was soon reduced so low that it was necessary to keep me almost always on deck, and from my extreme youth I was not put into fetters. In this situation, I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought upon the deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wished I could change my condition for theirs. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful and heightened my apprehensions and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites. One day, when we had a smooth sea and moderate wind, two of my wearied countrymen, who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow, who, on account of his illness, was suffered to be out of irons, followed their example. I believe many more would very soon have done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Those of us that were the most active were in a moment put down under the deck, and there was such a noise and confusion among the people of the ship as I had ever heard before to stop her, and got out of the boat to get to the slaves. However, two of the wretches were drowned, but they got the other, and afterwards flogged him unmercifully for thus attempting to prefer death to slavery.